This is 200 Betrayer's Husks. Legitimately farmed. I didn't trade for these, and these are not duped. These came straight from baby Belial himself. It took 128 hours to farm the materials and do the 1067 boss kills required for these husks. So these 100 Belial Supremes are the real deal. Do we get a Mythic unique from the first run? No. We find a 2-star Tacits of the Dawning Sky. I'm choosing the Beast and Ice treasure for a Fist of Fate upgrade. On run 3, ho ho ho! We find a 4-star Fists of Fate. Damn! Bro! Also, a 2-star Fists of Fate. On run 5, we find a 3-star Ring of the Ravenous. On run 6, we find a 2-star Fists of Fate. On run 9, we find a 2-star Pain Gorgers. On run 21, we find a 2-star Ancient's Oath. On run 23, we find a 4-star Fists of Fate. Damn! That's number 2! And then it's an upgrade. On run 28, we find 2-star Pain Gorgers. On run 33, we find a 2-star Ancient's Oath. But wait! It's a double offer. The number of uniques that had exactly 1 greater affix from Belial Supreme was 234 uniques. On run 35, we find a 2-star Mantle of Mountain's Fury. On run 42, we find a 2-star Tacits of the Dawning Sky. On run 44, we find a 2-star Ancient's Oath. On run 45, we find a 2-star Mantle of Mountain's Fury. On run 51, we find a Mythic unique. Ho ho ho! A 2-star Melted Heart. Mythic, baby! On run 56, we find a 2-star Fists of Fate. On run 63, we find a 2-star Hellhammer. On run 66, we find 3-star Pain Gorgers. On run 68, we find an Eom rune. On run 74, we find a 2-star Hellhammer. On run 75, we find 2-star Pain Gorgers. On run 77, we find a back rune. The number of legendary runes that dropped over the 100 runs was 3 legendary runes. On run 78, we find a 2-star Mantle of Mountain's Fury. Also, a 2-star Ring of the Ravenous. On run 82, we find a 2-star Ancient's Oath. On run 89, we find a Mythic unique. Ho ho ho! An Heir of Perdition. Ah, the purples! Baby! On run 92, we find 2-star Pain Gorgers. The most amount of greater affix uniques that dropped in a single run was 5 uniques. On run 96, we find a 2-star Hellhammer. On run 97, we find an Ahu rune. On run 100, the final run, do we get a mythic unique? No. We find a 1-star Ring of the Ravenous. Also, 1-star Fists of Fate. 2 mythic uniques and 100 runs. Seems similar to Andariel, Duriel, and Harbinger.